All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're literally stepping inside the war room of history. We're going to take a profound, highly serious look into a subject that, let's be honest, is usually remembered through emotion and political slogans, but very rarely analyzed through the cold, hard lens of military strategy. We are exploring the acclaimed work of Major General G.D. Bakshi, specifically diving into his text, Bose, the Military Dimension. And we're going to treat the Indian National Army and Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose himself not just as nationalist icons, but as subjects of serious operational and strategic military study.
So think about this for a second. What if India's freedom struggle wasn't just a political movement, but a direct, kinetic military challenge to an empire? It's a question that completely upends how we traditionally view the fall of colonial powers, doesn't it? We're so used to being taught that independence was purely a triumph of negotiation and civil resistance. But as we unpack Bakshi's chapters today, we're going to see that empires often require a massive physical and psychological shock to truly fracture.
Okay, let's dive into this strategic briefing docket. We'll start with Introduction, a military lens. Then, Bose, the Indian samurai. Next is 1942, the strategic window, followed by the INA in combat. We'll then look at the 1946 military revolts and wrap up with the final strategic impact.
Starting right off with Section 1, Introduction, a military lens, operational assessment.
We're stepping way past purely political memory today. To really understand the true weight of the Indian National Army, we have to evaluate it as a functional, operational force that was actively attempting to wage war against a global superpower. Why does this specific analysis matter so much? Well, because it asks the hard questions about leadership under incredibly hostile conditions. The INA was an army built in exile. I mean, how does a force like that even fight a modern war without secure bases? Major General Bakshi's thesis argues that we've got to look at how military morale interacts directly with political change. And sitting right at the center of all of this is Bose himself. He wasn't just an orator, he was a self-taught strategist, literally trying to build a military institution from scratch.
Moving right along to Section 2, Bose, the Indian samurai, the architect.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that Bakshi uses a very deliberate, specific phrase here, the Indian samurai. It suggests a deeply ingrained warrior ethic, right? It's all about courage, honor, and this absolutely unbending commitment to a cause. Bakshi frames Bose as a figure who realized early on that political frustration absolutely had to be converted into ironclad military resolve.
And the crazy part? Bose was essentially a self-taught commander. He didn't come from some prestigious traditional military academy. He learned through sheer observation, international engagement, and direct exposure to intense wartime conditions. But his true genius lay in execution. He didn't just stand up and give stirring speeches. He prioritized the physical architecture of an army. We're talking structure, command, recruitment. He fundamentally understood that visionary leadership is totally useless if you don't have the institutional backing to pull it off. He proved that intense historical necessity can actually forge brilliant leadership.
All right, Section 3, 1942, the strategic window. The fluidity of war.
Let's set the grand strategic scene in Southeast Asia with a fascinating military concept, lost victories. This perfectly defines the intense, biting frustration of the summer of 1942. You see, political time and military time, they almost never synchronize perfectly. This was a moment of unrealized possibility. A brief, tantalizing strategic opening existed just because of the sheer chaos in Asia, but the decisive military blow for Indian liberation hadn't actually been struck yet.
And this window of opportunity, it opened and closed incredibly rapidly. Early 1942 saw the old order totally destabilized. By mid-1942, aggressive Japanese expansion forced massive strategic gaps. And by late 1942, the British imperial system hit its absolute peak vulnerability. Bose's military ideas matured precisely in this chaotic little window. He saw clearly that imperial systems that look totally invincible on paper can suddenly become incredibly vulnerable when a larger global theater destabilizes them.
Let's move to Section 4, the INA, in combat, the operational heart.
We're zooming in now from the big picture of grand strategy right down into the brutal reality of the jungle, and looking at the sheer asymmetry of this conflict. On one side, you have conventional state armies. They've got abundant resources, secure bases, stable supply lines. On the other side, the INA. They're facing extreme logistical scarcity, operating entirely in exile, and depending heavily on external sponsors like the Japanese. And they had to do all of that while desperately trying to maintain an independent Indian nationalist identity. The friction that Bose and his commanders faced was simply incredible. No other way to say it.
Let's move on and see how this builds, because this extreme friction forced a really unique operational strategy. The INA's tactical progression was a masterclass in adapting to severe constraints. They organized from exile, navigated incredibly complex international sponsorships, and engaged a heavily supplied enemy in completely hostile terrain. But step 4 is absolutely the most vital: generating a psychological shockwave. Bakshi emphasizes over and over that the INA's combat performance wasn't just about taking and holding ground, it was about the resounding message of imperfect but absolutely unyielding resistance.
Which brings us to Section 5, the 1946 military revolts. Colonial collapse.
We can actually track the exact strategic consequences of this shockwave. When the surviving INA soldiers were put on public trial, it created a massive psychological blowback. The Royal Indian Navy, directly inspired by the INA's defiance, mutinied in 1946. At the exact same time, loyalties within the British Indian Army began shifting, and their morale just broke. The INA was the catalyst that made the very foundation of the colonial military structure wobble and ultimately crack.
So, the crucial point is exactly this. Armed forces do not exist in a vacuum outside of politics. Soldiers listen, they compare, and they judge. They are highly sensitive to the credibility of the state they serve. When the colonial order lost its moral authority, a loss that was heavily accelerated by the INA's military challenge, the loyalty of the native military just evaporated. These weren't isolated mutinies, guys. They were the direct psychological consequence of the INA's campaign.
Finally, Section 6, the final strategic impact. Calculations of empire. Let's pull the camera back for a second to view the ultimate historical legacy here. This is where we see the incredible fusion of political will and serious military imagination. Because an army doesn't always have to conquer the capital to win the war, right? It simply has to transform the calculations of the empire. The battlefield courage of the INA catalyzed the entire process of political decolonization. The true mechanic of freedom was this incredibly volatile mix of forces, negotiation, sure, but also severe military pressure and profound psychological shock.
Bakshi's narrative forcefully concludes with a pretty stark reality. The INA's legacy, combined with the revolts of 1946, helped force the British out in haste. Bose's military vision had strategic consequences that rippled way beyond the immediate battlefield in Southeast Asia. It struck directly at the very nervous system of the British Empire in India.
This completely reevaluates the mechanics of history, and it forces us to look at the true cost of independence. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. We've covered a lot of ground today, but I want to leave you staring at a really profound reality. If freedom was won, not just by peaceful negotiation, but by systematically collapsing a colonial power's military confidence, how must we now remember the soldiers of the INA?